I opened the front gate and froze. The flowers I had planted were gone, the windows boarded, and a sold sign leaned crooked against the fence. My own home had vanished while I was still recovering inside a hospital bed. Maya Thompson, a quiet woman in her late 40s, had spent her life caring for others, often ignoring her own health. After a sudden illness landed her in the hospital for weeks, she expected the familiar comfort of home upon discharge. But the world she knew had shifted, leaving her outside the walls she had once trusted. The story begins in the muted light of a late winter afternoon, with Maya standing at the threshold of a reality she barely recognizes. The street was quieter than I remembered. Too quiet. My shoes scuffed against the cracked pavement, the sound sharp in the morning stillness. A thin wind carried the scent of damp leaves and something metallic, faint, but unmistakable. I slowed my pace, noticing that the usual morning chatter, the kids chasing each other, the dog barking, had disappeared. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains or through half-open doors. Their eyes met mine for a second, then quickly slid away. Whispering. Too hushed to hear, but loud enough to feel. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I had been away too long. The house came into view at the corner, and my chest tightened. My own front gate looked smaller somehow, not quite the same. The garden, once bright with winter pansies and my stubborn marigolds, was bare. Dirt patches, weeds, and the edges trimmed too neatly. My flowers were gone. I reached for the doorknob. My fingers brushed cold metal, unfamiliar under my skin. The key fit, but the lock was stiff, as if resisting me. I hesitated. The door frame seemed narrower. The paint, once warm cream, was faded, grayish. Something was off. The living room window, usually spilling golden light by now, was dark, shuttered by heavy curtains that didn't belong. Shadows pooled behind them, moving only with the wind. I stepped back. My stomach sank. My heart pounded, but softly, like a whisper, almost apologetic. And then I saw it. Leaning against the gate. Sign. Big letters, red and white. Sold. I stared. My breath caught. Sold. My house. My life. My little corner of the world. A car rolled past, tires crunching gravel, and I flinched. I wanted to shout, but no sound came. I wanted to ask someone, anyone, how this happened. But the neighbors kept their distance. Their eyes avoided me. They walked faster, looked at the ground, muttered into their sleeves. I felt invisible. And yet, somehow on display. I tried the gate again, pushing it, even though I knew it was useless. It swung open with a groan that sounded like a warning. My feet carried me forward, but slowly, tentatively. Each step against the cracked stone felt like stepping through someone else's memory. The air smelled different here. Not bad. Just wrong. Familiar scents. My cinnamon candle, the faint tang of old books, the warm smell of coffee in the mornings, were gone. Replaced by nothing, by absence. I touched the door again. Cold, unyielding, unwelcoming. The metal under my fingertips seemed to pulse, like it knew I wasn't meant to be here. I stepped back, trying to remember what had been here. A doormat with my name. A little bell that jingled when someone entered. Welcome. Presence. Gone. The whispering grew louder in my mind. Not real words, just the sense of judgment, the unspoken question. Where were you? I tried to remember the last time I'd been home. The hospital hallway had been sterile and bright, humming with fluorescent lights. Nurses, machines, the smell of antiseptic. Days blurred into nights. I had thought of home constantly. I had imagined walking through the door, dropping my bag, sitting in my old chair, listening to the soft creak of the floor under my weight. That imagined door was warm, inviting, familiar. This door wasn't that door. I glanced around, desperate for some sign. A neighbor returning their mail. A familiar face leaning on a fence. Nothing. Only the street. Only the quiet. Only the sold sign staring at me, accusing me silently. My hands shook. I pressed them against the wood again, closed my eyes. The house had always held me. It had been more than walls and roof. It had been laughter, arguments, quiet evenings, The soft ticking of the old clock in the living room. I could almost hear it now, though the room was empty. Almost see the curtains swaying in a breeze that no longer existed. Car door slammed somewhere down the street. I flinched, but I didn't move. My chest ached. Panic rose like smoke, curling around my ribs. How could this happen? How could it be gone? And why did no one say a word? I walked closer, peering through the window, straining to see. The living room was empty, but I could still imagine the couch where I had napped on Sunday afternoons. The rug I had picked carefully, soft under my feet. Every object that had grounded me in my world was gone. Replaced by absence. Replaced by shadow. I ran a hand down the glass. Smudges left streaks across my fingers. Ghostly traces of what had been mine. I whispered a name that had never felt so hollow, home. The wind shifted, rustling leaves and carrying faint echoes of the street I had known. My knees felt weak. I had expected relief, comfort, familiarity. Instead, I was met with alienation. A sense of displacement so profound. I felt like I was trespassing in my own life. I stepped back, breathing shallow. The sold sign swayed lightly in the wind. It was concrete, heavy, undeniable. My house had been given away. My world had shifted while I slept, while I healed, while I trusted. I looked up at the darkened windows once more. Shadows pooled behind the curtains like waiting things. Watching. Quiet. Patient. Indifferent. I turned slowly, taking a step away from the gate, my shoes scuffing the pavement again. Each neighbor averted their gaze, whispering behind their hands, leaving me with a heavy realization. The world had moved on without me. And I was still standing in the cold, wondering how everything I had ever known could vanish so quietly, so completely. The door loomed behind me, unyielding. And for the first time I realized, I had no answers. Only questions. And the faint, stubborn hope that someone, somewhere, might still have them. The morning was pale, as if the sun had forgotten to rise fully. I walked slowly toward Mrs. Callahan's house, the one at the end of the street with the ivy climbing the brick wall. Her curtains were drawn, but I could see the shadow of her frame moving behind the fabric. I knocked softly, afraid of too much noise, afraid of too little. The door opened a crack. Mrs. Callahan peered out, her eyes squinting through the dim light. She didn't smile. She didn't ask me to come in. She just let the silence linger between us. "Mrs. Callahan," I said. My voice was small, almost swallowed by the street. "Do you know about my house?" Her eyes flicked toward the street, then back at me. A sigh escaped her, and she stepped aside. "Come in," she said, almost like a warning. "It's not what you think." The air inside was warm and smelled faintly of tea and lemon polish. The floor creaked under my weight. Everything felt too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath. I sank into the chair by the window. Outside, the street seemed empty, but I could feel the neighbors watching, whispering just beyond the curtain. Mrs. Callahan settled into her armchair across from me, hands folded over her lap. She didn't look at me directly. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I thought someone else would. But it happened fast. Your house. It changed hands while you were in the hospital." I blinked. The words were simple, but they landed like stones in my chest. My house. Sold. Without me. I could feel the memory of the living room, the soft hum of the lamp at night, the books stacked on the shelf, snapping away, gone. "How?" I whispered. My fingers clutched the edge of the chair. I never signed anything. I never. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost a murmur. "It was all legal. Too fast. Too fast. I don't know who told them you wouldn't be back so soon. But someone did. Someone moved quickly." Her words didn't explain anything. They were facts with no warmth, no anchor. And yet, they were the first thread I had to hold on to. I closed my eyes, trying to picture the house as it had been, the light spilling across the rug in the afternoon, the kettle boiling on the stove, the hum of my life inside its walls. "I keep thinking about all the little things," I said. "The sounds, the smells. everything that made it mine. My voice cracked. It's gone. And no one said anything. Mrs. Callahan shifted. People. They didn't want to get involved. Nobody really knows what to say in a situation like this. And some don't care. Life moves on. It doesn't wait for anyone. Her words sank into me like water over stones. I imagined the empty rooms again, the curtains drawn tight, the strangers walking across the floor where I had once stood barefoot. The world had become indifferent while I was away. And maybe she was right, maybe nobody really cared that it had happened. I thought of my neighbors on the street, their heads turned as I walked by, eyes darting, whispers barely audible. Why hadn't anyone warned me? Why had everything shifted in silence, leaving me outside the life I had built? Mrs. Callahan reached over and placed a hand on mine. Her skin was dry, lined with years, but it carried a kind of weight, a presence that reminded me of the hands that had once helped me carry groceries, hands that had once offered comfort. "I'm sorry, dear," she said. "I can tell you what I know. But the rest, you'll have to figure out." Her words were soft, but they carried truth. Someone had orchestrated this, carefully, quietly. The house, my memories, the small life I had built, all shifted out from under me. And still, the answer seemed just beyond reach, whispered in half-words and glances that never met mine. I sat back, listening to the quiet hum of her refrigerator, the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Life went on outside, oblivious. Inside, I felt a strange emptiness, like the room had absorbed a part of me I couldn't reclaim yet. "What do I do now?" I asked, but the words felt foolish even as I said them. Mrs. Callahan didn't answer immediately. She just watched me, eyes soft but distant. "You take it one step at a time," she said finally. "You gather what you can. Ask questions. Look for the truth in the small things. People, they'll give it to you if you're patient. Or they won't. That's the world." I nodded slowly. Her words were both a comfort and a challenge. They reminded me that even in the quietest, coldest moments, I had a choice: to stand still, or to start piecing together the life that had been stolen. I left her house quietly, the door closing softly behind me. The street was the same, yet every corner now seemed unfamiliar. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and I imagined the whispers of neighbors following me, like the faint rustle of paper or the soft tapping of shoes against stone. My hands brushed the gate of my house as I passed. "Sold." The sign swayed lightly in the wind. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to reconcile the reality of the world with the life I remembered inside. I could still hear Mrs. Callahan's voice, gentle but firm. Look for the truth in the small things. And maybe that was the first step. Not rushing, not panicking, just noticing, just listening. The house had been taken, yes. But the threads of memory, the quiet echoes of my life, those still lingered, waiting for me to find them. I walked back to the sidewalk, leaving the gate behind, letting the wind brush my face. The sky was pale, and the morning seemed to hold its breath. I realized that the world might be colder, indifferent, whispering in half-truths, but I was still here, still standing, still searching. And if I listened closely, maybe, just maybe, someone somewhere would answer the questions I hadn't yet learned to ask. The registry office smelled like ink and cold metal. I stepped through the doors, and the sound of my shoes echoed against the linoleum floor. A hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, steady and indifferent. Rows of desks lined the room, each one stacked with papers so tall they seemed to lean against gravity itself. The clerks moved slowly, methodically, as if every signature stamped and every form filed was a small ritual performed in silence. Paused, taking it in. The air was dry, carrying the faint smell of old coffee and toner. Outside, the city buzzed, unaware. Inside, time had slowed. I felt small here, a single body among the mountains of official paperwork. The waiting chairs creaked when I sat, and I traced my fingers along the smooth, cold armrest, trying to anchor myself. The clerk looked up when I approached, not unkind, just neutral. "How can I help you?" I "I need records for my property," I said. My voice trembled just slightly. I handed over my ID, hoping it would be enough. The clerk nodded, fingers dancing across a keyboard. Papers shuffled, stamps clicked. Silence filled the space between words. I watched the movements, precise and patient, and wondered how much was routine and how much was intentional. When the first stack was placed in front of me, I felt a pulse of anticipation. I picked up a document and squinted at the neat handwriting. My name was there, yes. But the signature, it wasn't mine. Dates I didn't recognize lined the margin, some before I'd even left the hospital. Names I had never heard of, filing dates that made no sense with my timeline. I leaned closer, the paper almost trembling in my hands. The ink looked fresh, but my heart sank. Fresh or not, someone had moved with intent. Someone had made sure these documents existed, carefully, deliberately. I flipped through more pages. The sale, the transfer of ownership, the notarized statements, it was all too clean, too precise. Nothing about it read like an accident. Every box ticked, every date stamped, every line signed. And yet it wasn't mine. Not really. I closed my eyes for a moment. The office buzzed around me. People waiting, phones ringing, a child crying somewhere. But it all felt distant, muffled. My mind replayed the memory of my home. The warm rug by the window, the shelves I had arranged over years, the kettle that whistled in the morning. Someone had taken all of that and hidden it behind stacks of paper and signatures that weren't mine. "Are you all right?" the clerk asked, noticing my pause. I nodded, fumbling for words I didn't have. I traced the lines of another document. The notary's stamp glinted under the fluorescent lights. Dates contradicted my memory. There were phone calls logged that I had never made, meetings I had never attended. Each page seemed to mock me. How could this happen? How could someone weave a paper trail so convincingly that even the law seemed to nod in approval? I leaned back in the chair, breathing shallow. The office felt smaller now, walls closing in. I thought of the neighbors, the whispers, the sold sign that had greeted me like an accusation. And now here these documents, cold, neat, unfeeling, they told the same story. My home was gone. My life had been rewritten without my consent. I studied the forms again. The names, the dates, the stamps, they were all real. Authentic yet wrong. Someone had orchestrated it. And the more I stared, the clearer it became. This wasn't a simple mistake. It wasn't clerical error or oversight. This was deliberate, careful, precise. A quiet panic settled in my chest, pressing like a hand I couldn't shake. I imagined the person behind it, watching, planning, knowing that I would be away, knowing I would be vulnerable. The thought made my fingers tighten around the edges of the paper. My hands trembled slightly, not just from fear, but from the realization of betrayal. I tried to breathe steadily, reminding myself to look at the facts. Facts, after all, were all I had. The signatures, the dates, the stamps, they were proof. Proof that someone had taken my life and converted it into something official, legitimate. And yet, proof was cold comfort when it left me empty-handed. I ran a hand over the desk, feeling the smooth veneer under my fingers. The stacks of paper seemed endless, like a forest of bureaucracy designed to confuse, to hide, to erase. I wanted to scream, to shout at the clerks, at the air, at the paper. But the office remained quiet, indifferent, humming with fluorescent lights and the low rustle of someone flipping through files. I returned to the first document, scrutinizing the signature again. I couldn't recognize it, not even a little. Someone had faked my mark so perfectly. I felt small and naive for ever trusting that my absence meant nothing. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had moved through my life while I was confined, sick, and powerless. And now these papers held the evidence of it. The clerk handed me a receipt for copying the files. I took it without a word, my mind elsewhere. The paper felt heavy, even in my hands. I stacked the copies carefully, as if touching them might make them real, or might make them mine again. I walked toward the door, pausing to look back at the towering stacks, the buzzing lights, the hum of indifferent bureaucracy. My chest was tight, my mind spinning. I understood now. This was more than a sale. More than a mistake. It was intentional. And if someone could do this, if someone could erase my life so cleanly, then I needed to know why. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, tires humming against asphalt. People talked, laughed, hurried past. But I felt the weight of the papers in my bag, the heaviness of proof, the quiet ache of absence. The street that had always been familiar now felt strange, as if every shadow carried questions I couldn't answer yet. I breathed deeply, letting the sounds of the city fill my ears. And yet, inside, a small spark flickered. Someone had taken my home, yes. Someone had rewritten the facts. But I still had these papers. And I still had me. One step at a time, I told myself. One document, one signature, one question at a time. The paper trail was long, confusing, but it was mine to follow. And maybe, just maybe, it would lead me back to the life that had been taken. The front gate creaked under my hand, a sound too familiar, too sharp in the quiet afternoon. Paused, letting the moment stretch. The air smelled faintly of rain, wet earth and cold wood. Across the street, a child laughed somewhere, the sound oddly bright against the gray shadow of the house. I stepped forward slowly, boots pressing against the cracked stone path. The sold sign still leaned against the gate, slightly crooked. I ran a hand along its edge, the paint rough under my fingers. My chest felt tight, heavy. I had imagined this moment countless times, the first step back inside my home, but reality was colder than any memory. The door opened without a sound. Froze. Inside, the living room was different. Furniture shifted, angles unfamiliar. Cushions that had molded to my body were gone. The books I had lined carefully on the shelf had vanished, replaced by titles I didn't recognize. Photographs, family, friends, small moments of laughter, were removed entirely. The air smelled faintly of someone else's cleaning products, sharp and sterile. I stepped across the threshold, the floor cool beneath my bare feet. Every step made the boards sigh under weight I had once expected to claim. The house felt smaller, stranger. My memories, once anchored to every wall, now drifted like smoke in the empty rooms. I reached the kitchen, fingers brushing over the countertop. Dust clung to my skin where no one had bothered to clean. I traced a line through it, a trembling finger leaving a small path in the gray. Felt like trying to hold on to air. The kettle I had loved, the one that whistled each morning, was gone. The cupboards carried a smell I didn't recognize. My hands lingered on the worn edge of the counter, the wood familiar yet alien. I moved to the living room, lingering by the window where sunlight had once pooled on the rug. The sofa was positioned differently. The rug was gone, leaving cold hardwood exposed. The little armchair where I had napped on Sunday afternoons, gone. The lamp I had twisted on carefully each night, casting a gentle glow over the walls, gone. Silence settled around me, heavy and unyielding, broken only by the faint creak of the floor beneath my feet. I sat on the edge of the sofa, letting my fingers brush over the fabric, feeling the texture but knowing it wasn't mine. Every object here had been touched by someone else. Every corner carried evidence of occupation that was not my own. My memories pressed against me, aching, trying to fill the gaps in the space, but they slipped through my fingers, intangible and unreachable. I noticed the walls. They were bare, stripped of the paintings I had chosen carefully over years. The frames I had loved, the photographs I had hung with pride, replaced by empty nails. A small breeze stirred the curtains, lifting them just enough to let light spill in across the empty floor. I traced the shadow with my eyes, trying to remember the warmth that had once been here. The house had been alive with subtle sounds before. The hum of the fridge, the soft ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the floor as I moved from room to room. Now it felt frozen, waiting, holding its breath. I could almost hear it whisper, "You are not welcome here." I walked through the bedrooms, each one stripped of its familiarity. Sheets were crisp but impersonal. Pillows fluffed differently. Closets rearranged. My own scent, soft, lingering, was replaced by a strange neutrality, a deliberate emptiness. I leaned against the doorframe of my former bedroom, letting the cold wood press against my back. My eyes swept the floor, trying to find a single detail that had remained. There was nothing I could claim. The silence pressed down, heavy with questions I couldn't answer. Who had moved in so quietly, so completely? Why had they erased everything that had been mine? Each empty shelf, each rearranged sofa, each absent photograph felt like a message. They had been here. And they had made sure I knew, even if indirectly, that I no longer belonged. I moved to the kitchen again, running a hand over the edges of the cupboards. A small dent in the counter caught my attention. Familiar mine, but I hesitated to claim it. It was too subtle, too fragile against the weight of everything that had changed. I pressed my palm flat, feeling the groove, trying to connect it to the years of morning coffee, late-night tea, quiet moments alone. A whisper of memory, but the air around it had shifted. I walked to the doorway leading to the back porch. Outside, the garden looked sterile. The flowers I had planted with care had been removed. Soil churned and replaced with uniform mulch. A wooden bench that had creaked under my weight each evening, gone. My hands brushed over the railing, rough and dry beneath my fingertips, the familiar splinters still present, like small reminders of a life that had been erased. I paused in the doorway, staring into the empty rooms one last time. The shadows stretched long in the late afternoon light, pooling across floors and walls like dark water. I traced the memory of my life through the shapes, the silence, the absence of touch. My fingers itched for connection, for a single familiar thing, but the house offered none. The floor creaked under my weight as I turned back toward the door. I didn't lock eyes with the strangers I caught glimpses of, figures moving quietly, carefully, like they were trying to avoid disturbing the ghosts. I left them in the shadows, as I had left my own past there. Outside, I drew a deep breath. The wind carried a faint scent of rain and mulch, neutral and sharp. The sold sign swayed slightly in the breeze, an unspoken reminder of absence and change. I reached for the gate, feeling its familiar resistance. The world outside felt colder, indifferent. And yet I realized, even in the emptiness, even in the deliberate erasure, there were traces. Dust on the counter, a dent in the kitchen wood, shadows that remembered the shapes I once moved through. Evidence that I had been here. Evidence that life had been mine. I stepped back onto the cracked stone path, letting the gate swing softly behind me. My chest ached, but my mind was stirring. The rooms were empty, the walls silent, but I had seen enough to know. They could not erase the fact that I had belonged here once. And if I looked closely enough, if I listened closely, maybe I could find a way to reclaim it. The morning fog hung low over the street, softening the edges of houses and cars, turning everything into a blur of gray and shadow. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the damp settle into my sleeves. The world felt uncertain, like a photograph that hadn't developed properly. As I walked past my former house, shapes moved in the haze. People I didn't recognize, wandering slowly, smiling politely, but coldly. Their eyes skimmed past mine, never lingering. It was a deliberate kindness, a smile that asked nothing, gave nothing, and yet weighed heavily in the quiet air. I stopped and watched them for a moment. The fog swallowed the street beyond, leaving me in a narrow bubble of visibility. My mind reached for memory, for faces I had known. Mrs. Callahan waving from her porch, Mr. Davis nodding as I brought in groceries, but the neighbors I once knew felt like ghosts. Hollow echoes of warmth that no longer existed. A chill ran down my spine. I wondered, for the first time in months, if I had ever truly belonged here. Or if the house, the neighborhood, my life, had always been fragile, like glass that only looks solid until you pressed against it. The fog shifted, brushing against my cheeks like fingers. Every sound, distant footsteps, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, deliberate. A car engine rumbled softly behind me, then faded. The world around me had grown quiet, watchful, as if it were holding its breath. I remembered the sold sign, the empty rooms, the papers at the registry. Each of those moments had carried weight. Now, the faces in the fog seemed to echo the same truth. Someone had moved through my life while I was vulnerable, carefully, invisibly. I walked farther down the street, keeping my gaze low. Each neighbor I passed looked at me briefly, polite and neutral. They smiled, but not with their eyes. Not with recognition. My chest tightened. My home, my world, had shifted. And the people who had once been anchors were no longer mine to trust. A figure paused across the street, hands tucked into pockets, shoulders stiff. For a second I thought it might be someone I knew, someone who could explain, someone who could ground me. But it wasn't. Their face was blank, polite, careful. And when our eyes met, I felt a subtle warning behind it, an unspoken message that not everything was as it seemed. I pressed my hands into my pockets, feeling the cool fabric, trying to center myself. Memories of laughter from the porch, the scent of Mrs. Callahan's baking drifting across fences, the nods and waves that once made me feel part of a community. All of it felt distant, unreal. These faces in the fog didn't belong to the world I had known. They were shadows, moving deliberately through a neighborhood that had once been mine. I paused at the corner, the fog swirling low around my ankles. The street lamp flickered faintly in the gray, casting long, uncertain shadows. I imagined the house behind me, stripped, silent, waiting. The windows stared blankly, curtains drawn. My memories pressed against the walls, but the people out here, these polite strangers, reminded me that memory alone could not protect me. A whisper of doubt settled in my mind. Could someone close to me have betrayed my trust? Someone I had counted on while I healed, someone whose face I had expected to be warm and familiar, now replaced by neutrality, by polite detachment. My stomach knotted. The fog seemed to close in, pressing softly against my chest, carrying the weight of questions I could not yet answer. I walked slowly, each step measured, listening for sounds in the mist. The neighbors' faces passed again, a subtle choreography of politeness, indifference, and watchfulness. I wondered if they knew. If anyone knew. If someone had orchestrated all of this carefully, while I was confined, trusting, unaware. I thought of the registry office, the paper trail, the signatures that weren't mine. I thought of the empty rooms, the furniture rearranged, the photographs removed. And now these faces. It was a puzzle with no edges, pieces that refused to fit. Someone had moved through my life, leaving subtle traces, shaping a reality I didn't recognize. The street stretched ahead, fog blurring the horizon. Shapes shifted, branches brushing windows, a dog padding along the sidewalk, a car gliding silently by. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, a quiet pulse against the fog. I was aware of every detail, the smell of wet earth, the faint metallic tang of morning air, the soft click of a gate down the block. Each sense anchored me, even as everything else felt unsteady. I stopped, taking a deep breath. The fog obscured much, but I could see enough. The polite, cold smiles. The blank eyes. The subtle avoidance. The weight of absence behind every gesture. My home had been taken. My life rewritten. And now my world, my neighborhood, was populated by strangers who carried silent warnings in their smiles. I realized in that moment that belonging had never been guaranteed. That trust could be broken quietly, invisibly, like the fog itself. I had lived in warmth and familiarity, but even that could vanish, leaving only questions and unease. And the faces in the fog reminded me. The truth might be closer than I thought, but it would not reveal itself easily. I exhaled slowly, letting the damp air fill my lungs. The street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to move, waiting for me to act. I felt the quiet pull of determination, subtle but persistent. I couldn't change the past, couldn't reclaim what had vanished, but I could start piecing together the truth. The fog lifted slightly as I turned back toward my former home. Shadows lingered across the pavement, long and uncertain. The street, once familiar, now felt fragile, like a world balanced on glass. I stepped forward carefully, mindful of each sound, each movement. Every face I had seen in the mist, every polite but cold smile, carried a piece of a story I had yet to uncover. And I knew, quietly, that someone close to me, someone I had trusted, might hold the key to it all. The fog shifted again, curling around streetlights and fences, hiding shapes and intentions. I walked on, letting the silence guide me. The world beyond the fog waited. And so did the answers, somewhere in the quiet, hidden among the faces that refused to smile with their eyes. The lamp on my desk flickered softly, casting long shadows across piles of papers and my laptop screen. Outside, the city hummed, distant horns and tires against asphalt blending into a low, steady rhythm. I sat on the edge of my chair, fingers hovering over the keyboard, the glow of the screen washing my face in pale light. I opened the first email, scrolling slowly. My eyes caught phrases I didn't recognize. Messages sent in my name to people I hadn't spoken to about decisions I had never made. My stomach knotted. The sentences felt mechanical, neat, too precise, almost detached. Someone had written them carefully, deliberately, knowing they would pass for me. I ran my hand over my face, the skin warm beneath my palm. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, a mundane contrast to the gnawing unease in my chest. My mind reached for reason. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I had been in the hospital. I had been confined, unable to move, unable to make these calls. And yet here they were, digital traces of a life rewritten. I sifted through bank statements next. Transactions I didn't recognize, withdrawals that conflicted with dates I had recorded in my own notebook, payments I never authorized. My pulse picked up, each line of numbers twisting a knife in the soft margin of my memory. This wasn't just an error. This was deliberate. Someone had mapped my life while I was absent, moving pieces with precision, leaving breadcrumbs I had never left. I leaned back in the chair, letting the hum of the laptop fill the silence. I could feel the weight of months pressing down on me. Hospital days, nights alone, moments I had assumed were safe. The world I had trusted had shifted while I slept. And now, every document, every record, carried the echo of someone else's hand. I picked up hospital records, scanning dates and signatures. Some entries didn't line up with my memory. Procedures I had never consented to, notes I hadn't written. My pulse thrummed in my ears. The familiarity of my own handwriting, my own initials, had been replaced, duplicated, faked. Someone had learned enough about me to pass for me. And that realization pressed into my chest like a stone. I closed my eyes, listening to the low buzz of the lamp, the soft hiss of the radiator. Anxiety built, a slow, creeping weight that pushed against the walls of my mind. But with it came determination, sharp and clear. If someone had orchestrated all of this, if someone had stolen my life in my absence, then I needed to find them. I needed to know who had that power over me. I opened my phone next, scrolling through call logs. Numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails I hadn't received. Texts sent in my name that I had never written. Each notification felt like a small betrayal, a subtle confirmation that the life I remembered was not fully mine anymore. I ran a hand through my hair, gripping the strands as though holding on might make sense of it all. I looked around the room, the desk cluttered with papers, the laptop screen reflecting my eyes, wide and unblinking. Shadows from the lamp stretched across the walls, bending and folding in ways that reminded me of corners in my memory I hadn't noticed before. What had once been comfort, small rituals of daily life, now carried fractures, gaps I couldn't bridge without answers. I pulled out a notebook, starting to jot down inconsistencies. Emails, transactions, dates, names. Each line a small excavation of my own life. Patterns emerged slowly, faint like cracks in ice. Someone had moved carefully, quietly, leaving enough of me intact to make the falsification believable, but not enough to prevent discovery. Each note I made twisted my understanding of what had been real, creating shadows where warmth once lived. Hours passed unnoticed. The light outside shifted, a faint glow of early evening creeping through the window. I didn't move. I didn't eat. My hands traced the edge of the desk, the cold wood grounding me as I catalogued the betrayals. Every document, every record, every digital footprint felt like a piece of a puzzle I was only just beginning to see. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of unanswered questions settle on my shoulders. Who had this knowledge of me? Who could manipulate my life so completely, while I was powerless to intervene? And why? The questions burned softly, pressing against the quiet hum of the room, unresolved, demanding attention. I opened the laptop again, tracing email headers, timestamps, IP addresses. Each clue revealed more gaps than answers. The world I thought I knew, my routines, my relationships, my home, had been infiltrated by someone invisible, meticulous, deliberate. The realization made my hands shake slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of comprehension. Someone had control over my reality. And if I didn't act, they could continue to shape it. I breathed deeply, letting the quiet tension ebb and flow. Each document, each record, each subtle discrepancy reminded me that life is fragile, that trust can be fractured silently, invisibly, like shadows folding in the corner of a room. But awareness brought power. Understanding brought a path forward. I organized the papers, stacking them in careful piles. Emails, bank statements, hospital records, phone logs. Each stack was a fragment of truth, a guide through the labyrinth that had been my life. And within those fragments, a sense of resolve began to harden. I would follow this trail. I would find whoever had orchestrated the disappearance of my home, my agency, my sense of safety. I stood, stretching tired muscles, letting my gaze sweep the room. The lamp cast soft golden light over the papers. The shadows danced, folding into corners as if hiding secrets still undiscovered. I felt a quiet tremor of anticipation, the delicate balance between fear and determination. I looked out the window at the darkening street, silent now, except for the occasional hum of a car or the distant bark of a dog. The world had moved on, indifferent to my unraveling. But I had these pieces. And I had myself, still present, still noticing, still questioning. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. My life had been fractured, rewritten without consent, but fragments remained. And from these fragments I would rebuild. I would trace the truth, step by step, document by document, until the shadow behind it revealed itself. The lamp flickered again, soft, golden light catching the edges of the papers. My fingers lingered on a single signature, a single email, a single inconsistency. The trail was long, confusing, deliberate, but it was mine to follow, and I would follow it. Somewhere, in the quiet, deliberate unfolding of facts, the person who had stolen pieces of my life was waiting, and I would find them. The phone vibrated on the edge of the kitchen counter, a sharp, insistent tremor that echoed in the otherwise silent apartment. I didn't recognize the number. Neither did the next one. And the next. Each ring sliced through the stillness like a fingernail on glass. I watched it pulse, my hand hovering over the counter, reluctant to touch it, afraid that answering would confirm something I didn't want to know. Shadows shifted in the corners of the room, cast long and trembling by the single lamp I had left on. A draft stirred the curtains, brushing my ankle. The apartment felt alive, watching, waiting. The first message appeared on the screen. "It's not too late." I stared at it, thumb hovering, unsure whether to swipe or ignore. The second. "Some doors are meant to close." I froze, heartbeat loud in my ears. The words were brief, cryptic, deliberate. Whoever sent them knew something. Something I couldn't yet grasp. I walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the city lights blurred by mist and rain. Below, the streets pulsed with life, cars gliding past puddles, people moving with purpose. And yet up here, in my apartment, the stillness carried a weight that pressed into my chest. Felt eyes on me. A presence, subtle and precise, lingering where it shouldn't. I picked up the phone cautiously, reading the messages again. There was no signature, no clue. Only the sense that someone was inside my life, not physically perhaps, but close enough to reach me wherever I was. My hands trembled slightly as I set it down. The shadows along the walls seemed to deepen, stretching toward me, folding over furniture, pooling in the corners. I moved to the couch, pressing my palms into the cushions, trying to ground myself. I could feel the texture of the fabric, the faint scent of detergent, the faint warmth of memory lingering from evenings I had spent here alone, reading, thinking, breathing. But tonight even the couch felt wrong, too familiar, too empty, too watched. Another message came through. "Do you remember who's left?" The vibration startled me. I sat frozen, eyes scanning the room, tracing every corner, every edge. My apartment had never felt so foreign. Shadows shifted again, longer, deliberate, almost conscious. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, felt amplified, waiting. I tried to reason it out. Someone could be pranking me, perhaps. A wrong number. But my gut twisted against the explanation. This was too precise, too timed, too personal. Someone knew my movements, my moments of solitude. The phone, once a lifeline, now felt like a conduit, a tether connecting me to something unseen. I walked toward the hallway, footsteps muted against the carpet. The lamp cast my silhouette along the wall, thin and stretched, merging with the shadows in odd, uncomfortable ways. I paused, breathing shallow, sensing a shift in the air. There, a faint click, almost imperceptible, like a hinge moving somewhere far away. My body tensed. The apartment, my sanctuary, had become a stage, and I was no longer the sole actor. Another message. Some truths are easier in the dark. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, feeling the cold press into my spine. I tried to focus, to reason. The shadows, the vibrations, the unseen presence, they could all be imagination. But imagination doesn't leave fingerprints on instinct. My instinct screamed caution. Someone was reaching out. And I didn't know if they were friend or foe. I glanced at the table where my keys rested, the pen I used for notes, the scattered pages of documents from my recent discoveries. Each object carried a trace of my life, my agency, my choices. And yet tonight, each of them felt vulnerable, exposed, like they could be observed, manipulated. The apartment walls seemed thinner, the corners more alive. I tried answering the phone. My thumb hesitated over the green icon, then pulled back. Silence hung between the next vibration and the one after. Every ring, every message carried intention, but no immediate revelation. Whoever it was, they were pacing me, observing my hesitation, testing boundaries. My breath came in soft bursts, matching the rhythm of the shadows stretching along the walls. The city outside hummed with indifference. I could hear faint honks, tires over wet asphalt, someone shouting in the distance. But inside, silence pressed, punctuated by the phone's persistent reminders. I sank lower, curling slightly, letting the cold edge of the floor remind me that I was still real, still present, still noticing. Another message blinked onto the screen. "You can't hide from what's been done." The words landed with quiet force, folding over my chest like a heavy blanket. I felt the weight of everything. The house lost, the documents forged, the neighbors I couldn't trust, the unseen manipulations. And now this. A persistent, deliberate contact reaching into the edges of my solitude. I closed my eyes, letting the dark behind my eyelids meet the shadows across the room. The apartment seemed to breathe around me, slow and measured, carrying faint hints of movement where none should exist. The air was thick, warm, yet slightly metallic, as if memory itself had acquired a scent I couldn't place. I opened my eyes. The lamp cast pools of light across the floor. The couch, the table, the bookshelves, they were stationary. But the shadows in the corners shifted slightly, as if acknowledging my presence, folding into new shapes when I looked away. My mind tried to map it, name it, understand it. The sensation was both fear and intuition, layered, indistinct. I picked up the phone again. I could see the history, the messages stacked one after another. "It's not too late. Some doors are meant to close. Do you remember who's left? Some truths are easier in the dark. You can't hide from what's been done." Each phrase, brief and cryptic, carried purpose, a deliberate nudge. I felt the pull of something larger, something orchestrated. I pressed the phone to my ear, holding it but not dialing. The screen glowed softly, illuminating my face in pale light. The apartment seemed to hold its breath with me. Shadows leaned slightly closer, then receded, teasing the edges of perception. The line between fear and intuition blurred. I could feel it now, the presence that had lingered, subtle but undeniable, somewhere just out of reach. I exhaled slowly, letting my fingers trace the edge of the table. My pulse steadied, but the awareness remained. I was being contacted deliberately. Someone knew enough to reach me. Someone knew enough to unsettle me. And whoever it was, their intent, friend, foe, or something else entirely, was yet to reveal itself. The phone rested against my palm, silent for a moment, then vibrated again. I stared at it. The shadows remained still now, patient, deliberate. Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent. Inside, I realized something. The silent phone was not just a device, it was a doorway. Test. A warning. And perhaps, the first step toward understanding the truth I had been chasing all along. I sat back against the wall, letting the lamp glow across the papers scattered at my feet. Shadows moved slowly along the floor, curling like fingers. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been and I wouldn't be. Not while the messages continued. Not while the silent phone insisted I pay attention. Somewhere on the other end the line waited. And I knew, softly, quietly, that I had to answer. The night air was sharp, damp with the smell of rain-soaked pavement and wet leaves. I stood across the street from my former home, coat pulled tight around my shoulders, breath rising in small clouds that vanished immediately. The streetlight flickered faintly, illuminating the windows of the house like lanterns in a void. A warm glow spilled from inside, but it felt alien. The light should have felt like welcome, like home, but it didn't. It pressed against the glass with purpose, spilling into shadows that weren't mine. My fingers traced the edge of the metal fence separating us, cold, rough, unyielding, and I realized how little of this world remained in my control. I leaned forward slightly, watching movement inside. Shadows shifted across curtains, figures passing quickly from room to room. Family, a stranger, or perhaps someone waiting, expecting me to arrive tonight. My chest tightened. I felt the floor beneath my feet tremble with anticipation, even though it was the asphalt outside that held me. Every window carried a story I was no longer part of. A flick of a hand, the flash of a silhouette, the subtle tilt of a chair. These small, mundane motions should have been ordinary, but in the quiet of night, under my watchful gaze, they felt deliberate, territorial. The house was theirs now, or at least it claimed to be. I pressed my palms to my eyes, letting the darkness behind my lids merge with the shadows inside the house. Memories surfaced unbidden. The sound of the kettle whistling, the floor creaking under my bare feet, the way sunlight had once struck the living room at dawn. All of it was gone, replaced by a foreign familiarity that belonged to someone else. The house had been a vessel for my life, my choices, my laughter. Now it was a stage for strangers. I crouched low on the curb, my coat damp against my thighs, eyes fixed on the front door. My mind raced. Could I even reclaim it? Legally, the papers I had found at the registry office had told their own story. Signatures I hadn't made, dates I hadn't witnessed. Emotionally, that too felt fractured. The walls I had painted with my life, decorated with my memories, now carried echoes of someone else's ownership. A figure paused by the window nearest me. I couldn't make out the features clearly, but the presence was deliberate, watching, perhaps sensing my observation. My stomach churned. Whoever they were aware. Perhaps aware of me. Perhaps waiting. The thought made my skin prickle, the chill in my spine curling like smoke up my neck. I took a slow step back, letting the shadow of the streetlight stretch me into the night, keeping my presence hidden. Every instinct whispered caution. Every memory ached with loss. This was my house, my life once. But tonight, standing across the street, I couldn't claim it. Not fully. The walls were fractured, the life within altered, and the notion of reclaiming it felt both urgent and impossible. I knelt, tracing a line in the wet asphalt with my fingertip, letting my hand linger on the cold, rough surface. I thought of all the small moments that had made this house mine. The way sunlight fell across the kitchen counter, the scent of old books lingering in the living room, the quiet hum of nights spent reading alone. They had all been stolen, not violently, not loudly, but quietly, with precision. Movement inside again caught my eye. A shadow, bending, pausing, shifting. I felt a pang of recognition and fear simultaneously. If this was a family, they were unaware. If this was a stranger, then perhaps they had known exactly what they were doing. The air thickened, pressing in around me, carrying a sense of inevitability. The house might never be mine again, not as I remembered it, not as I hoped to reclaim it. I rose slowly, letting the damp coat slide over my shoulders, trying to anchor myself in the reality outside. The street was quiet, almost too quiet. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of past laughter, past footsteps, past conversations that had once filled these walls. And yet, the house inside remained alive, inhabited, foreign. I pressed my hands together, steadying my breath. Part of me wanted to cross the street, to push open the door, to demand entry. Part of me knew that the act itself might erase the last traces of control I had left. The house was a vessel now, and I was outside, watching, suspended, caught between memory and reality. I took a careful step back, letting the streetlight elongate my shadow across the wet pavement. The figure inside had vanished from the window, leaving only the faint glow behind. I realized then that the house didn't belong to me anymore. Not legally, not emotionally. My claim was paper-thin, fragile, like frost on glass, and the world had moved on without me. A sigh escaped me, soft, almost swallowed by the night. I pressed my palms to the wet asphalt again, feeling the chill, the texture, the tangible reminder that I still existed, even if the house no longer recognized me. Memories lingered in my mind like faint echoes, fragile but persistent. Perhaps they were all I had left to reclaim. I glanced at the windows one last time. Shadows had settled, light dimmed to a warm, steady glow. The movement inside had stopped, leaving only the faint outline of furniture, the silhouette of lives I could no longer touch. I stepped back further, letting the night embrace me, the street hum beneath my shoes. And then I understood. The house could never fully belong to me again. Not as it had. Not as it once did. The walls held memories, yes, but now fractured, splintered by absence, altered by another life. I could watch, I could mourn, I could plan. But I could not undo what had already been taken. I turned slowly, letting the mist wrap around me, letting the streetlight fade behind my back. The house stood there, glowing softly, beautiful and foreign, as if daring me to step closer. My chest ached, quiet and insistent, a reminder of the life that had been, of the home that had once been mine. Somewhere in the hush of night, I whispered to myself, soft as the mist, "It isn't over. But tonight it already feels lost." The storage unit door creaked as I pushed it open, a sound loud in the empty lot. Dust swirled in the thin beam of my flashlight, catching on floating particles like tiny stars. The air smelled of mildew and old paper, a scent that should have been unpleasant, but instead it felt familiar, tethering me to a past I'd almost forgotten. I hesitated at the threshold, listening. Only the soft hum of the city far away, muffled by the concrete walls, and the faint scratch of rats or maybe loose hinges. My hand lingered on the cold metal latch. I could turn back, leave the past buried, but something urged me forward. A quiet insistence, a pull from the boxes stacked along the walls. I stepped inside. The floor was littered with fallen packing paper and faint footprints that weren't mine. I ran my fingers along a crate, feeling the rough wood, the small dents that told stories of handling long ago. The light from my flashlight flicked over labels fading into yellow, handwritten words curling at the edges. Kitchen, books, letters. I hadn't seen them in years, yet recognition sparked a low, warm ache inside me. I moved from box to box, pulling at lids gently. Papers rustled, photographs slipped from envelopes, corners curling. A letter from a neighbor, a photograph of a birthday long ago, a note in my mother's handwriting. Each object held a pulse, a heartbeat of memory. I could almost hear the laughter, the conversations, the quiet moments between. Then I found it. A small plain box at the very back. I lifted the lid slowly, afraid it might shatter the fragile bridge to my past. Inside, neatly coiled letters tied with string, photographs stacked in chronological order, and at the bottom, a single key, small, brass, cold. I held it in my palm, turning it over slowly. It felt heavier than its size, heavy with promise, heavy with questions. The letters were the first I opened. Words written in careful script, familiar yet distant, spoke of deals, promises, subtle warnings I had never noticed at the time. A neighbor writing about a trust in good hands, a friend mentioning changes beyond control, my own hand, once young and naive, signing forms I had barely read. The handwriting danced across the pages, connecting dots I hadn't yet seen. I spread the photographs on the concrete floor. The images were mundane. My living room, a holiday gathering, the small garden, but details now leapt out, clues embedded in plain sight. Faces that looked friendly then, now marked with subtle expressions that whispered secrets. Glances exchanged, smiles that didn't reach eyes, shadows lurking just behind. My chest tightened. The house, the neighbors, the so-called friends. They weren't quite what they seemed. The key gleamed under the flashlight, calling silently. I ran my fingers along its ridges. Could this open a lock somewhere, a drawer, a box, a hidden truth? I imagined it fitting into some forgotten mechanism, turning, revealing the secrets that had cost me my home, my peace, my certainty. I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable, blooming alongside the ache of loss. The storage unit smelled stronger now. Dust, paper, old wood, but also something else. A faint hint of ink, like the letters themselves carried a scent of truth. I leaned down, reading another note, scribbled almost in a hurry, warning of hidden deals and misplaced trust. My heartbeat quickened. Betrayal was layered here, waiting in ink and paper, not shouted, not dramatic, but precise. I felt the weight of it all pressing in. Every letter, every photograph, the key itself. They were fragments of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. Someone had planned this. Someone had watched, waited, and acted. And now, maybe, just maybe, I had a piece that could undo the story they had written over mine. I paused to close my eyes, letting the silence of the storage unit settle over me. My fingers rested on the key. It felt warm, alive with possibility, with memory, with justice. The letters whispered quietly from the box, stories I had ignored because life had carried me forward until now. Pain and hope tangled together, a knot that refused to untie itself easily. I imagined returning to the house with this knowledge, stepping through the door not as the frightened former owner but as someone with leverage, with insight. Could these relics truly help me reclaim what was mine? Or were they just echoes, reminders of a past that had already slipped from my grasp? The line between reclaiming and remembering blurred, and I had to admit that perhaps both were necessary. The key felt heavier in my hand the longer I held it, its weight magnifying my resolve. I ran my fingers over its grooves, feeling the history embedded in the metal, imagining the locks it might open, the truths it could reveal. Somewhere in this city, behind some door, a story waited to be told, and I held the instrument to tell it. I gathered the letters and photographs carefully, tying them with string as best I could, and slipped the key into my pocket. The small sound of metal against fabric was grounding, a tactile reassurance that I now held something tangible, something active, in a life that had felt unmoored for too long. As I closed the lid of the storage unit, the air pressed in, heavy with the smell of memory and dust. Paused, taking a deep breath. The city night was cold, distant, indifferent, but inside me a spark had reignited. Something was moving, shifting, and I could feel the path forward beginning to take shape, however tentative. Stepping out into the street, I let the cool night air wash over me. The mist clung to my coat, The pavement glistened under the dim streetlights. The storage unit loomed behind me, silent but full of secrets. The key in my pocket pressed against my side like a heartbeat. I realized that this night, this discovery, was the first time I had felt a sliver of control in weeks, perhaps months. I walked slowly toward the main road, glancing back at the storage unit one last time. The letters, the photographs, the key. They were my tether, my leverage, my fragile map through a maze of betrayal and silence. Whoever had orchestrated the loss of my home, whoever had turned my life into a maze of absence and shadows, now had a reckoning awaiting them. And somewhere in the folds of the city, in the quiet corners of forgotten spaces, the truth waited for me. I was ready to find it. The sun was low, painting the street in molten gold that blurred edges and softened shadows. I stood at the curb, my fingers gripping the small brass key I had found in the storage unit. My pulse thrummed loud in my ears, louder than the quiet hum of distant traffic. Across the street, the house glowed in the fading light, familiar yet unrecognizable. I inhaled slowly, tasting the smoke of someone else's cooking drifting through the evening air. It should have been ordinary, comforting even, but tonight every smell, every sound carried weight. Every neighbor who glanced our way held a polite, unreadable smile, and I felt the street itself holding its breath with me. I stepped forward. My heels clicked softly against the pavement. The door opened before I could knock. A woman appeared, cautious, her smile polite but thin. Her eyes did not meet mine. I recognized the posture, the hesitation. It mirrored my own. "Can I speak with you?" My voice trembled, betraying the calm I tried to wear. She nodded slowly, stepping aside. I crossed the threshold, the familiar floorboards underfoot replaced by polished unfamiliarity. The living room smelled of air freshener and new upholstery, a strange cleanliness that seemed to scrub away all memory. I hesitated at the doorway, noticing the empty spaces where my photographs had once hung. I used to live here," I said, my voice low. I let the words hang, fragile as glass. The woman tilted her head, curious but guarded. "I know," she said softly. "I didn't mean to." She paused, glancing toward the man behind her, a man whose hands were folded, expression neutral. They seemed careful, rehearsed, as if preparing for a conversation they had anticipated for some time. I swallowed, feeling the weight of months of absence, of betrayal pressing down. I just need to understand," I said. My eyes darted around, seeing the corners I knew so well, altered in subtle ways, touched by strangers' hands. Every object, every shift of furniture, felt deliberate, as if my absence had been noted and calculated. The conversation began slowly, words chosen, sentences measured. The man spoke first, his tone calm, almost rehearsed. "The sale, it was legal. We bought it through the proper channels. There was paperwork." He glanced at her, as if seeking permission to continue. "We didn't want to hurt you." "Hurt me?" My whisper carried the tremor of disbelief turning to quiet anger. "My home, my life. How could this happen without me knowing?" The woman's hands twisted together. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. The previous owner, someone close to you, made decisions you weren't aware of. We thought it was complicated, confusing. And we didn't know how to explain it." I sank onto the edge of the couch, the fabric unfamiliar, the air heavy. Memories of quiet evenings, laughter, the scent of old books, surged and collided with the present. My heart ached. Yet beneath it, a flicker of clarity began to ignite. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone I had trusted. "You knew," I said, voice small but steady. "And you let it happen?" They exchanged a glance. "We didn't know everything," the man admitted. "We only followed the papers, the process. It wasn't personal. But now we see how it looks." His voice was soft, almost regretful. The sun dipped lower, spilling amber across their faces. Light streaked the room, catching dust in slow motes, giving the space a dreamlike quality. Shadows stretched across the walls, elongating and bending with the day's dying warmth. I pulled the brass key from my pocket, turning it over in my palm. "And what about this?" "Yes. This key, these letters, photographs, they point to more than just paperwork. Someone wanted this, planned this." The woman flinched slightly. "I don't know." Her voice was quiet, uncertain. "We were just in the middle of it. We didn't create it." "Then who?" My whisper was sharper now, urgency threading through the calm. "Who did this? Who had the power to erase me?" They said nothing for a long moment. The only sound was the wind rattling the blinds and the distant hum of cars on the street. I felt the past months of confusion and fear crystallize into a singular piercing need. I had to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "I want answers," I said finally. "Not just explanations, but honesty. Full honesty. Even if it's painful." They nodded slowly, and I could see it in their eyes. A mixture of guilt, fear, and the faintest hint of sympathy. It was enough to start, enough to illuminate cracks in the story I had been given. I felt the room shift around me, the weight of absence lifting slightly, replaced by the tremor of potential understanding. The sun touched the horizon, turning the sky to a muted blend of orange and violet. Shadows deepened, crawling along the walls and across the floor. The house seemed to breathe around us, alive with memory and tension, familiar yet foreign. I rose from the couch, the brass key tight in my fist. "This doesn't fix everything," I said softly. "But it's a start." My voice carried a resolve that surprised even me. For the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of control, of direction, of reclaiming the narrative of my life. They watched me, cautious, wary, as if realizing that I might be more than the displaced owner they had assumed I was. Perhaps they understood that truths, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. The sun finally slipped behind the horizon, and the room dimmed into soft twilight. Light lingered, casting long shadows that felt almost protective, as though the house itself was holding fragments of my story for safekeeping. I stepped toward the door. My shoulders straightened, my gaze clear. "Thank you," I said, and it was a quiet declaration, more to myself than to them. "For listening. For telling me what you could." Outside, the street stretched empty and calm, the last streaks of sunlight dissolving into night. I walked slowly toward the curb, letting the cool air wrap around me. In my pocket, the key pressed against my fingers, a tangible reminder that my story was far from over, that clarity, though partial, had begun. And as I looked back at the house, silhouetted against the darkening sky, I realized something. Confrontation had given me fragments of truth, yes, but also the weight of what remained hidden. Shadows lingered in corners, in gestures, in the spaces between words. The night swallowed the street, but I carried a spark with me. A spark of hope, of resolve, of the knowledge that even in fractured walls, a story could still be reclaimed. The sky was bruised with twilight, streaks of purple and amber folding into one another. I stood at the front gate, fingers curling around the cold metal, feeling the weight of months pressed into the lines of my palms. The street was quiet now, the soft hum of evening settling over everything. A few leaves drifted lazily along the pavement, stirred by a hesitant wind that seemed almost unsure of its own path. I inhaled slowly, tasting the faint scent of wet earth and fading flowers. The house rose before me, familiar and foreign all at once. Windows glowed warmly, but I didn't recognize the light anymore. I wondered, as I had so many times before, whether it was still mine, if it ever really had been. A small bird hopped along the fence, chirping softly, oblivious to the tension that clung to me like a second skin. I watched it for a moment, wondering if it had ever known the years of laughter, the quiet mornings, the scent of old books stacked in corners. Memories surged and retreated like tides, each one sharp, tender, impossible to hold. I stepped forward, and the gate creaked under my weight, the sound splitting the silence like a held breath. My heels clicked lightly on the walkway, each tap echoing in rhythm with the pulse in my chest. I paused before the door, hand hovering over the brass knob. I could feel the house watching me, the walls remembering everything I had left behind. I remembered the empty rooms, the cold floors, the strangers' shadows in my furniture, the silence that had swallowed my life whole. And yet, there was something here that no one could erase. Something in me. A quiet, stubborn pulse that refused to be ignored. I let my hand fall from the knob, brushing it against the smooth surface before stepping back. I didn't need to enter tonight. Not yet. The house could exist without me. I had to exist with myself. I leaned against the gate, letting the cool metal press into my palms. My eyes drifted upward, tracing the last streaks of sunset across the sky. There was grief here, yes, a heavy, anchoring grief, but there was also clarity. I had chased shadows, turned over stones, confronted strangers, unearthed lies, and yet the deepest truth lay not in the walls, not in the deeds of others, but in my own presence. I thought of the letters, the photographs, the brass key, fragments of a past that had been threatened, stolen, and reshaped. They were pieces of my story, yes, but they were also reminders that memory is not property. It is a thread we carry with us, fragile, flexible, unbound. The street was empty now, save for the occasional flutter of a curtain, a distant bark of a dog, the sighing wind that seemed to echo the rhythm of my thoughts. I closed my eyes, letting the air settle over me, the quiet stretching long and deliberate, giving my mind space to untangle itself. I imagined the laughter that had once filled these rooms, the soft rustle of pages turning in my favorite chair, the warmth of morning sunlight pooling across the kitchen floor. I felt it all, the absence, the presence, the ache, and I let it be. I didn't need permission to feel it anymore. A neighbor walked past, nodding politely. She didn't stop, didn't stare, didn't ask. I nodded back, and in that small exchange there was recognition. I belonged here not because of walls or signatures, not because of deeds or sales, but because I had chosen to return, to witness, to reclaim my own story step by step. I straightened, letting my shoulders roll back, feeling the tension ease like mist dissipating in the cool evening air. There was a rhythm here, slow and steady, a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. I realized then that reclaiming home was not about possession. It was about standing on the threshold and knowing who I was, despite everything, despite absence, despite change. The gate swung open with a whisper, brushing against my hand. I stepped through, letting the threshold mark not an entrance into property, but a crossing into choice. I could linger in what was gone, or I could honor what remained. And for the first time in months I felt I could do both. Inside, the familiar scent of furniture and new life mixed, strange but not unwelcome. I walked slowly across the floor, letting each step anchor me to this moment. My fingers trailed over surfaces, careful, reverent, not reclaiming but acknowledging. I had been here and I was still here. That was enough. I paused in the living room, the room where the sun once spilled gold across the rug, and let my gaze wander. Shadows lengthened in corners, but they did not frighten me. They were reminders of time's passage, of lives intertwined and separated, of the quiet lessons that linger when walls hold their breath. I thought of the conversations, the confrontations, the revelations that had led me here. I had seen greed, deception, fear, and yet I had also glimpsed honesty, regret, human complexity. The world was still fragile, the street still uncertain, but I had found something sturdier within myself. The sky outside deepened to indigo, stars beginning to prick through the evening veil. I walked to the window, leaning against the sill, watching the street stretch silent and calm. The world had changed, yes, but so had I. I closed the door behind me finally, slow and deliberate, feeling the click echo like a heartbeat. It was a small sound, ordinary, but it carried meaning. Not ownership, not triumph, not possession, but choice. I chose to step back, to carry my life forward, to let presence define home more than walls ever could. And standing there, in the quiet after the door closed, I whispered to myself, "Can home truly exist outside a house?" The night answered in silence, soft and forgiving. I smiled faintly, knowing the question was not a challenge, but a companion. I had lost much. I would lose more. But tonight, I had reclaimed one thing that no one could touch. Myself. I turned toward the street, toward the darkening horizon, and walked slowly, deliberately, into the life I still had to live, carrying both loss and hope in equal measure. The threshold behind me was closed, yet the story before me stretched wide, unbroken, waiting for each step I would take.